I want you to think about the story and where you've been and the turning points in your life and the people you've met along the way that changed everything, or that taught you that one thing that you really needed to know at the moment you needed to know it. And finding voice for that story is 100% possible. And, I started the storytelling course that we did in person before COVID, because I knew that there were people that were stuck, and you were one of them. I was so happy when I saw your name come through when you signed up, because it just means that you're saying yes to something that I know is a powerful thing for someone to do. And when you begin to give voice to your experiences, it changes you. And it also impacts others, because then anybody that's been through anything similar sees how you came through it and learns. And, where would we be without one another's stories?
Hey guys, welcome back to the Daron Earlewine Podcast. Daron Earlewine, your host, here with a very special guest today, Emily Sutherland. Emily, welcome to the Daron Earlewine Podcast.
Thank you, Daron. It's good to be here.
So when you get a copy, and I say when because I know we're all going to get a copy of the book, The Death of a Dream, you're going to turn into one of the first pages that talks about just the acknowledgments and all the positive things. And right on that page, it's going to say, to Emily Sutherland, your partnership in this project was everything to me. I would never have found the courage to write this book without your encouragement. There would be no book without your talent. Here's to many more projects together.
Thank you.
So Emily was my coach, my confidence, my courage, my writer behind the curtain in some ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about that process, Emily. And one thing I want to hit on in this episode is we've been going through this past couple series here on the podcast, ramping up to the book launch. We did a whole series called The Death of a Dream, where we talked to folks who had experienced that and how God had walked them through that. Then we just spent 6 weeks talking about the resurrection of purpose and what needs to happen through that. And we've got a couple weeks here right before the book launches. And what I wanted to do is sit down with you and have a 2-part conversation and really kind of talk about the process that you helped me walk through to bring this dream to life. Because as John Maxwell says, right, teamwork makes the dream work. And there was a lot of teamwork between you and I that happened even prior to the beginning of the book starting. And so I want to unpack that, because I think you've worked with, how many books have you written or helped write?
I can't remember the number.
Honestly. A lot.
I don't know.
So you've helped a lot of people's dreams come true in this space. And it's a difficult process.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Not just writing books, but I think anything is that lives as a dream in our heart. There are so many, sometimes seen and tangible, but oftentimes unseen, intangible obstacles and roadblocks that keep us from accomplishing that. And you helped remove a lot of those for me to help this happen. And so what I hope is through our conversation and kind of talking through that process, we can unlock and maybe remove some barriers for people and see if we can't see some new dreams resurrected through this.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Awesome.
For everyone out there.
So Emily, let's do a little backstory. One thing that I love is when we first started to get to kind of talk about doing this, I don't know if I ever met you like 25 years ago when your husband was at Indiana Wesleyan University, where I went to school. He was like assistant chaplain, I think was probably his role.
Yeah.
And I was a punk 18, 19-year-old kid, and your husband Scott was like the cool guy that helped out with chapel, right?
Well, he called you the cool guy. So I knew about you. I didn't know you. I know we didn't meet back then.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was always admirable of your innovative spirit.
Well, I appreciate it. I loved him. And he was instrumental in those years of spiritual development and everything. For me, what's kind of crazy is what's in this book, I was living a lot of that out right next to and in concert, with in relationship with your husband.
Right.
And then we come, together to put this project together. So it's just cool to see how all that comes together. But tell us a little bit more about Emily Sutherland, who you are, what you do, so people can kind of get to know you, and then we'll get into the process.
Yeah. Well, now I help people write their books, which was always my dream. That's and maybe not even books. I wanted to write other things too, music and all kinds of things. Somebody asked me, so do you see yourself doing, is the ultimate dream doing, screenplays or books or songs, and I was like, yes, because to me, words are so powerful, and being able to play with them in different mediums was just always the dream, right?
How early did that start for you, Emily?
I think the first time that I recognized writing as a thing, it had to have been third, fourth, or fifth grade. It was probably third or fourth grade because I know where we lived. We moved every 3 years. My dad was a pastor like yours was. And unlike your dad, we didn't stay in place very long. And the place that we lived, I remember how old I was when we lived there. That's the only reason I remember. But I was looking at the album cover where, and these were like the big LPs at the time because
albums,
I'm old. And that's what we had. And I had this little portable turntable that kind of unfolded like a suitcase, and I would listen to records. And I remember listening to this record and reading the lyrics along with the record and feeling the power of words and how they can change your thinking.
Yeah.
And I believe that's when the bug hit. Like, that's a thing. And I hope I can do that thing someday.
Yeah.
But I didn't know anyone that was a writer who could make a living at it. I didn't know anyone. I was doing reports on people like Emily Dickinson, who most of her work wasn't discovered until after she was gone. Same with Bach, so many great writers, people found their things later. And I was like, I don't want to be dead.
I'd like to do this for a living now, not after I'm dead.
Yes, I would love to leave my family with a great heritage, but come on, So, but then I began working, when I was 27, I began working for a music company in which those artists were writers. They made a really great living writing. And I worked with them for 20 years, and I saw how they did it, and they actually mentored me. They trusted me to write a lot of their work. And in that process, working for artists and seeing all of the different kinds of writing and being able to do a lot of it, I got to do writing for television. I got to do writing for books. I got to do writing for marketing, and then I got to do ghostwriting. And that wasn't even a thing I had even on my radar when I was 8. I didn't know that people did that, but I was able to listen to how people spoke, and they would tell me kind of what they wanted to say, and then I would say it in a way that sounded like them because they didn't have time to sit down and hash it out because they were touring and doing all these other things, running a business, many businesses. And so I really learned to kind of listen to people when they were talking and learn how they would say, you can say 10 different, one thing 10 different ways or 100 different ways, depending on who's saying it. And I began to pay attention to that, And so then I began to do that for other artists. And then there was a comedian that wanted me to do that for him. And so it was just a really interesting education working there for 20 years and learning the power of knowing how to write and all the things that you can do with it, know. So that really prepared me. And then as that music company was starting to get smaller and the figureheads there, the artists were not touring as much because they were just aging. They were wanting to spend time with their grandkids at that point. I decided to go out on my own, and I retained them as a client, but then I was able to start doing other things. And within 3 months, I got a call from Auntie Anne, the founder of the famous pretzel company that with all those yummy soft pretzels in the mall and the airports. And I loved her before I ever met her. Let me tell you what.
You have done so much for my life. You didn't even.
Yeah, I was like in tears.
Yes.
But I met her through the music world, and she was a music fan herself. And we met, and she wanted me to write her book, and that was just kind of the beginning of my own journey to be able to help people process their stories. Yeah. And it's been just a dream come true, literally.
What I think is so amazing, Emily, and I've talked about this, if you're faithful, listener or watcher of the podcast, I make this point all the time when we talk about people stepping into God's call in their life, is that like it's in you from the beginning. You know, when you come to faith in Christ and he awakens your spirit, and we talk about spiritual DNA here on the podcast, like I believe that it's the ultimate of it, and it gives access to everything and who God is and who you are, but it's already in you.
Right.
When you were 8 years old, and it's like there could have been millions of people walking right beside you in life doing those things. There could have been 10 people looking at the back of that record. They've been like, yeah, word's cool. Hey, turn it up. Or whatever their perspective would have been. Or this is stupid. Turn it like, but for you, like something deep within you said, this is for you. And I think the amazing thing is not only was there a sense of where, and I would say, you know, your spirit was waking up to something. The cool part that God had uniquely gifted you to do. And, you know, if you're listening, you're watching right now, maybe you can look back, and maybe you've listened to other, you know, conversations we've had here on the podcast. If you haven't gone back and done some of the life mapping that we actually have you do, if you take spiritual DNA, there could be some moments that you've missed. Where right now you're feeling like, man, I don't feel like I'm living the life that God created me to live. You may need to go back and think about, were there some moments back 8, 9, 10 years old that you thought that was no big deal, right? Everybody thinks like that. That no, like they don't. Like that was God beginning at that early process going, hey, we're going to go on this path. Like I've got something for you over here. And so, Emily, that's a little more about you. I love it already. We could just push stop right now. That was worth the price of admission, which is free, by the way. But when we came together, I had a friend who said, hey, I'm going to this storytelling class. Do you think you want to go? And I thought to myself, no, I don't think I want to go. But then something in me was like, hey, and this, the interesting part was, I'm trying to remember when we first met, it had to be after COVID, wasn't it?
I believe it was before COVID. I think Jenny connected us, and we had lunch with Jenny.
Yeah.
And then we didn't talk for a while about it.
Yes.
And then you came to the class.
Yes.
And
so it must have been pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Which is interesting how that's set up, because the idea, because for me in the story, like as COVID brought the death of another dream of mine, of the whole radio deal, like there was a whole, you know, kind of year there of trying to like pivot into like greater purpose. Okay, God, what's happening in my life and world? But before that, I had gone to the storytelling, you know, class that you were hosting, and now I want you to talk about it, because now you've created a whole online deal, right? And
yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. I won't rabbit trail.
We'll talk about that. But I went because there was a part of me feeling like, I know that I've always had this dream that I'd love to write a book. But for me, that felt completely impossible to do. Because for me, you know, I've got, you know, my friend Mark Moore, he's a writer. I've got friends that are writers, and they're like writers. Like they know how to write a sentence. Like they spell words correctly. You know, they know where commas go. Like there's so many times when I'm even writing like a text message or an email, and I'm like, I think should be a comma here somewhere. Like, I don't know, like maybe I took a breath here. So I think there's a but, I think somewhere, but I can't remember any of the grammatical things you're supposed to do in English. And so I just thought, that's something that I could never accomplish. And I came to the storytelling course with you, and it was just a day. I mean, it's like an afternoon, right?
Yeah, it was. I think it was like 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.
Yeah.
So people could get their kids from school.
Yes. And by the end of that day, you took us through, and I want you to talk a little bit about through a process where for the first time I took what I thought could be a story that would help people, and you led us through just starting to storyboard that out and put it together. And literally, like without that storytelling course day, like I would have never written this book, because I would have still been in a place of going like, it's not for me. So what motivated you to want to create a course like that?
It is really wild. Where do ideas come from?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we believe the Spirit,
right.
You know, and I, at the end of the day, that's the answer.
Sure.
But I found myself, you know, meeting people or having people that I had in my life that I didn't realize had stories and were interested in telling them. And, you know, to hire me to to write your book is a whole different price point than maybe if I got some people in a room and helped them have the tools to at least get started or to map it out themselves. And I thought, for the many, many people that I'm meeting that can't really hire me to just, do a 1-year project to help them get their book into words, maybe there's a process. I can teach them the process I use.
Yeah.
And I was sitting down with some people and doing a consultation that was about the same price point as the class ended up being. And I thought if I could say this one time and hit 10 or 15 people, that'd be amazing, and that's what we did. Yeah. So it was just a matter of trying to get everyone in the same place so that I could say it once and that they could meet each other, meet people that were also trying to write their stories. And as soon as I put it online, and it was just kind of one of those things that one day I was just like, I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to pull the trigger. I've been talking about it. I have all the information in my head. I've mapped it all out. I'm just going to put it online and see what happens. And immediately people started signing up. And I just remember being like, oh my gosh, people are doing it. Like, I can't believe it. I thought if I had 5 people, I would have been happy. And we ended up packing 12 people in my living room, And that was a gratifying experience that people even, were open to walking through the process, because it is a scary process to be vulnerable enough to tell your story.
Yeah.
And the fact that people would get into the room, and I remember exactly what you're talking about. Some of the things that, the memorable moments for you were also for me, because when I start seeing it click, like the light up in their eyes to say, oh my gosh, maybe I could do this, that's a beautiful thing. And to have experienced that once, I was like, oh, I'm doing this again, because the energy in the room and the camaraderie and seeing people wake up to the possibility that they could do this, they could write their story, and that it was valid and important to do, was that was a great moment for me, because I thought I can help you do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was a couple that day. One of the ones, and I want you to talk about this, is there was a moment that you had us take some reflection time and recount somebody's story that we had read that changed our life in some capacity. Talk about why you did that in that part of the course.
It was all very, as I was writing the workbook that we used and started thinking about what is the process that a person needs to go through in order to really get their story out. And the first part, at least for me, because I'm a perfectionist and I can talk myself out of anything, if I can't do it perfectly, or if I am not convinced I can do it perfectly, is the mental game. And I think that was important to me to set out before we ever started talking about your story, to say, okay, story matters, and stories have mattered to you in a way that maybe you haven't even identified. And so I wanted people to identify a story that mattered to them and say, because that story mattered to you, perhaps your story matters to someone else later down the road. And that just was a dot I wanted to connect, a couple dots I wanted to connect for people. Yeah.
Well, for me, Emily, it was so huge because, I went back and grabbed, a couple, books and stories in my brain, and you had us go around the room and share, right? And then at the end of it, you said, okay, now I want you to imagine your life if that person had never told their story. And that was the moment, like linchpin moment, where I was like, I have to write this book, because I thought, it didn't matter if 10 people read the book or 10 million people read the book, but like if I could be obedient to get this story in print, and one other person could have the moment that I realized, like, if I hadn't heard that person's story, my life would not be the same. Like, I realized, like, this is so much more about, like, this, I have this dream that I want to try to accomplish. And so I can say one day before I die, like, hey, I wrote a book. Like, no, I don't want to just write a book because I want to write a book. Like, because, like, God has written a story in and through my life, and I think it's for someone else. Right. And I think when we make those kind of connections, I think it's so important, especially if someone has a dream they feel like that maybe God's put in their heart that is in the creative realm of life, because, and you talked about this in the whole year we worked together, of just the whole, like, imposter syndrome, how strong that is.
It's very strong.
Right? Like, I'm not an author. I don't know how to write. No one wants to hear what I have to say. Like, they're going to laugh. This is stupid. Like, all these things.
All the fears that you have.
Constantly.
They come to the surface.
Yeah. And so to know, like, if you're listening, you're watching now, you're like, I've always wanted to write, I've wanted to be a poet. I've wanted to write screenplays. I wanted to write songs. I want to create, right? If that's in you, like, honor the fact that there is a desire there, and the reality that even if it's just one other person, it's like, my favorite author and pastor, speaker, Errol McManus, right? One of the core values of his church is that creativity is the natural result of spirituality.
Absolutely.
And it is. And so there's an actual spiritual, act in the process of creating.
It is. And that's where, when you get into saying, well, how did you think of this? At the end of the day, that's what it is.
Yes.
It is my spiritual life coming into some sort of tangible form.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And I also, what's something that you said about, the imposter syndrome and the, I'm not a writer, whatever. I very specifically remember that day when we were trying to get the critics out of our heads. Mm-hmm. Yep. And when we were putting the messages that were running through our heads into a jar.
Yep.
To shut them up.
Yep.
Because we've all got them, and that jar was full.
Yeah.
It's still packed. I've never emptied it. I've got all of those colored pieces of paper with the messages that people wanted to silence, and then we crammed them in that jar to close it up. And yours was that you weren't a writer.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, you need to put that little mouse that's lying to you on your shoulder into this jar, because maybe you're not an editor.
Yeah. No, I'm not an editor.
Like the punctuation and stuff, you can get somebody to figure that out. Yeah. But you had a story that was important to you to tell, and that makes you, once you start telling it, a storyteller, a writer.
Right. Well, that was, I forgot about that moment. I remember writing that and putting it in the jar, and then I remember we sat down a few months after that, because there was some time passed, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go after this. And I started sharing, some of the dreams and visions with some of our sponsors for our nonprofit, and, had a couple that stepped up and said, hey, listen, like, we want to help make this happen. We believe in this project, And so I reached out to you, and we sat down for one of our amazing breakfasts at Cafe Patachou. That's the greatest breakfast ever. And they're not a sponsor of the podcast, although we are looking for sponsors for the podcast. So Patachou, listen, we will eat cinnamon toast every time we put anyway.
Yes.
But we sat down, and I remember saying to you, well, for one, we started just kind of putting the chapters and the ideas together, and you kind of let me just ramble and talk. And there were moments of you just affirming, like, I can remember you just, like, I would just tell a story about something, and you would be like, that's a good story. Mm-hmm. Like, there are lots of good stories here that need to be told. Mm-hmm. But I remember another major life-changing conversation in this process was, we had gotten to the point where you'd help me kind of frame it all out. I had an idea, and we were thinking, I think at that point I knew there was going to be somewhere around 14 to 17 chapters or something in my brain. And I got close to, and I think I may have even started to, like, sit in my office and try to, like, write. And I remember calling you and saying, like, I think it was a breakfast, and being like, Emily, this feels so daunting. Like, I remember sometimes we would have, and by the end of the meeting, I would feel like there was, like, an elephant sitting on my chest of, like, there's no way I'll ever accomplish this. And I said, Emily, like, I can't write 14 to 17 chapters of this book. Like, I just can't do it. And I'm just ranting and processing, out loud. And I was like, if you told me that I was able to write if I was going to go write a 17-week sermon series, I'm like, that feels life-giving. That's amazing. I know how to write sermons. I know how to present them. I know how to put that together. That's the way my brain works. But, like, I don't know how to write, 17 chapters of a book. And you were like, well, then you're not writing a book anymore. And I remember being like, oh no, I think Emily just fired me. But you said, you're not writing a book anymore. I want you to go write a 17-week sermon series.
Right.
And that was probably the last and maybe strongest green light that you gave me, because I realized okay, wait a second. I can go do this the way I can do this.
Right.
In that process for me, I realized I can't write this book in my house. I can't write it in Indiana even because I can't have distractions. I don't think I have ADD, but maybe I do. I don't know.
I do.
Okay. So for me, I booked a cabin in Arizona. I was like, I got to go back to where everything started for me. I got to get alone. And, I spent a week recording, I think by the end of the week, I had gotten 14, what were, like sermons recorded, and I paid to get all those transcribed and sent you thousands and thousands more words than we could probably ever fit in a book if it, would have come out like an encyclopedia. But I was able to get all of that and all that structure done. And I couldn't believe I got that much done in a week. But and it was like shortly before that, I had read an article somewhere just through figuring out like 3 of my favorite authors. That's how they write all their books. They speak them in. And I was like, I didn't know this was a thing. Like I could actually do this. And so that's, the process, that we took. But we had talked about before, we started recording about how often we think that that we have to take the path of most resistance.
Right. Yeah.
Or it has to, if it's not hard, somehow it's less than or something.
Exactly. Oh, I definitely grew up believing that. I definitely did things the hard way. And I think in my 20s, I was burned out by my 20s, because I did everything the hard way. I did, if there was a way to complicate it, boy, I could find it. And I remember being so tired and so burned out. And I remember looking around me, I'm like, there is nobody patting me on the back for having done everything the hard way. Nobody's up saying way to go, Emily. Yeah. That was really smart. Right. I'm like, I am paying the price for doing everything much harder than it needs to be. I'm complicating everything. And then I just began to reassess, how many of the things that I'm doing aren't even necessary. What is really even essential of the things that take my time during a day, and paring down processes so that you're getting right to the thing that you're really good at. That's been a years long process, probably decades long process for me. And I still work on it all the time, but I do love to impart on anybody that will sit and listen. And you did, in this process, to say, maybe this doesn't have to be as hard as it could be. If you were going to sit out and pound out chapters, you might still be working on it. Yeah. And here we're sitting here holding it. Yeah. And everybody on the recording can't see this, but I mean, it's beautiful and done. And, how you got there needed to be a path that worked for you. Yes. And I think a lot of people don't think of that, and they think it has to be this, pulling all-nighters and, sweating over a computer or a notebook or, bless people back in the day that had to longhand it. But, working with your strengths and what you're good at, and you're good at speaking. And, I would not be good at that. If you asked me to do a 17-part, series, speaking series, I would not be as keen on that, because that's not my strength. But we like to play to your strengths, so it doesn't have to be harder than it needs to be. Yeah.
Well, and that was the beauty of this whole process when people, and I guess, I'm the guy teaching spiritual DNA, right? Saying now just, discover your strengths and leverage them, you know what I mean? And then it's, the last person to take my own advice. But it was that, and looking at it and realizing there was a teamwork dynamic that made this so life-giving. And I mean, once people have asked, this summer a ton of times when I've been speaking, had the book finally with me of how long did this take you? And I'd be like, well, it took me about 20 years, right? Of stories, right? But it took about a year and a half, give or take, maybe 2 years. But it was never it was joyful.
Good.
I can't wait to do it again.
That makes me so happy to hear.
Well, good.
That's the way I feel like when your dream is coming to fruition. Yeah. There's nothing that said that it had to be miserable. Right. Right. I'm so happy to hear that.
No, it was so joyful. And the cool part is after doing it once and the way that worked for me and partnering with you, it was okay, I can, not only can I, I'm going to do this again. Right. And I think that's a part of where I think once I've said this before, maybe I stole it from somebody, I don't know, but God loves to work with inertia.
Right.
And when we finally get moving, towards a dream, something is put in us, and finding the way that we're uniquely going to do it. It's like, then I think it's like, okay, I have someone who's moving. I have someone who's ready to go. Like we can pour a little, gas on the fire here to get things going forward. And that process, happened for me. And I think is even looking at, the last, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 chapters, there were a few of them that like I did sit down and actually, go after on the keyboard, because I think I had started to figure that part out, even to, some of it more. And I don't know, the whole process, it was life-giving. And so what I want to do, we're going to do another episode where I want to talk about the nuts and bolts and you interacting with the material and that process. But as we close out this episode, I want you to talk about specifically about how you've created now the storytelling course. It's an online, version people can get into. I want you to promote that, because I know there's somebody that's going to be listening or watching, and they're going to be like, okay, I'm where Daron was 2 years ago. Like,
yeah, I bet there's so many people out there.
I need someone to partner with me in this creative dream, process. So talk a little bit about the course.
If you're listening right now, just pretend like you and I are sitting at Patachou having breakfast, and I'm telling you,
can I close my eyes and just
can you smell that cinnamon
I can smell
toast?
that cinnamon toast.
It's just so
the
good.
Coffee's so good too.
Yeah, I love that coffee.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
The hairbender. Yummy. I want you to think about the story and where you've been and the turning points in your life and the people you've met along the way that changed everything, or that taught you that one thing that you really needed to know at the moment you needed to know it. And finding voice for that story is 100% possible. And, I started the storytelling course that we did in person before COVID, because I knew that there were people that were stuck, and you were one of them. I was so happy when I saw your name come through when you signed up, because it just means that you're saying yes to something that I know is a powerful thing for someone to do. And when you begin to give voice to your experiences, it changes you. And it also impacts others, because then anybody that's been through anything similar sees how you came through it and learns. And where would we be without one another's stories? And if you're out there and you're in that place, you're like, but how do I start? That's exactly why I have put this course into online form. And I literally sat in front of a camera and just did a brain dump of like this process, and exactly the process that I brought you through in that first group in January of 2020, right before everything shut down. That the magic that happened in that room, I tried to bring it online so that if you don't live in the area where we're doing these, or the schedule doesn't work for you, you can just do it from your house or your cabin in the woods or your car from your phone, on lunch hours, because it's just so important to me to know that anybody that has a story to tell, that that you can, and that if there's a way that I can help you do it, then I want to do it. And that's what the online course is about. It's at my website, emilysutherland.me is where it sits. And you just, once you buy it, I just send you a link to all the assets and the workbook. And if you have questions, you email me. If there are things that you run into where you're like, I'm stuck, it's the beginning of a conversation so that we can get that story out of you.
Yeah. I love it. EmilySutherland.me is where you go for the website. And I just want to encourage you is that, I think, I don't know if it's a Western American thing, but we feel like we need to be self-made people, right? Like I gotta do this on my own. This is my thing. And I think if you've got a creative type dream, maybe it's worse because you feel so vulnerable.
Sure.
Right. But you don't need to do it on your own. And I would say the mass majority of people don't.
Right.
Like if you want to do it on your own, your art is probably going to stay in your garage.
Right.
Right. You may be able to do it, but at some point, if the creativity that God is pouring through your life, if it's going to bring life and hope and joy, instruction, whatever good to other people, at some point you're going to have to trust somebody else in the process.
Yes.
And I just want to say, from my experience, Emily Sutherland is one of the best people you can trust in this process. You helped me start this process. You helped me believe that I could do it. And in the whole year we worked together on this book, like literally every time we would either be face to face or I got a chance to call Emily, like you've obviously enjoyed probably hearing her voice on this podcast, but it was just your voice and your demeanor, your spirit, your creativity, everything. It brought so much peace and comfort to me to feel like you are someone that believed in me and this process, and you knew how to get where we needed to go, and you did it with such a grace.
Thank you.
That is so necessary in this kind of work. And so EmilySutherland.me is where you can get the course. Are you doing them live some here in Annapolis area too?
I don't have any scheduled for the remainder of 2022. If I am sensing there's a demand, I will redo them. COVID kind of stopped everything.
Yeah.
I had one scheduled for that April after the one you attended, and we had to shut it down, and I didn't bring them back until earlier this year. And, we filled a couple rooms early this year, and then I started thinking about I might make our in-person things a little different. I might restructure that. So I'm putting what we did online so that's like a good starting point.
Yeah.
And then I'd love to maybe do weekends.
Love it.
With writers, and we can go deeper and maybe listen to each other's ideas and, kind of go deeper into each other's stories, because that's something we didn't have time to do before. So they're going to look a little different in 2023, but we're working on it.
More creativity. I like it.
I like it. I'm
awesome.
excited.
Hey, stick with us. It's the next episode. Emily and I are going to talk a little deeper into the process we did to actually create this, the whole process for the death of the dream, resurrecting purpose when life doesn't go as planned. If you haven't pre-ordered the book yet, go to barnesandnoble.com and do so right now. It makes such a difference to launch the book, and it would mean the world to me and to Emily.
Yes, please.
And so check that out. And until we talk to you here in the next episode, remember these three things. God's for you, not against you. He's near you. He's not far away. And he's created you on purpose and for a purpose. We'll talk to you next time on the Daron Earlewine Podcast.